All right, we are live. We are live. We are live. How's everyone doing today? So, we've been talking about the hemp ban a little bit. Did a video about this about 5-6 days ago, but I've been waiting to talk to the man, the myth, the legend, the really the first lawyer on this entire topic. Somebody I talked to a couple years ago. If you ask anybody that's in this business in THCA, most likely they worked with this lawyer, aka Rod Kipe. And we're going to do a whole breakdown of the hemp ban, what's going to mean for potentially your business, what it's going to mean for your state, and a few other things as well. So thanks for joining us, guys. Let's jump into it. Okay, here he is. Here's the man.
Hey, Luke. How you doing?
Going on?
It's good to be here today. I appreciate you inviting me on to talk about the hemp ban. It's really important, and everyone needs to know, what happened, what it means, what we can do, and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So, I think a lot of people are up to date really on what happened, but if we could do like a quick overview of what happened. I know there's a lot to it, but give us kind of
there's a lot of technical issues, with passing a bill and stuff. But essentially, the government shut down due to some, a lot of political stuff about funding. And about 40 days into it, there was a bill that was called a continuing resolution that was put forth in the Senate to get the government back on track. There was a lot of momentum to get the government funded and reopened. And as the bill was going through, there were some anti-hemp provisions that were put in there that had nothing to do with funding, nothing to do at all, but it was a sort of an opportunity for the anti-hemp folks to slide in something that they knew was likely to pass, and that is the continuing resolution. So that passed the Senate. It went to the House. The House could have rejected it. They could have sent their own, continuing resolution that didn't have the anti-hemp stuff and sent it back to the Senate. But again, there was a lot of momentum. The House passed it, and the president signed it. So now we have a funding bill that carries us funding into January. But it also has these anti-hemp provisions. So that's what happened. I've been saying this a lot, and I think it's really important to know this was not a referendum on hemp. I've seen a lot of people say, "Oh, the hemp industry had it coming. This is signals what Congress really wants." Blah 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 blah. Certainly, there are members of Congress that don't like hemp or think that hemp needs, is fine, but needs certain regulations. But there are a lot of, there's a lot of support in Congress for hemp. And this was a referendum on getting the government reopened. It wasn't about hemp. I think a lot of members of Congress just couldn't vote against it because the political backlash of not opening the government would have been really, really difficult for them. So yeah, that's where we are. And I'm gonna take these off because it looks like I've got some glare. So we're gonna go the no glasses route. So if you throw up any documents that I need to look at, then I'll put them back on. So
okay, anyway. No, I think we'll be good. Yeah. So really, they slipped this in. They, like you said, they leveraged I think it was the longest government shutdown of all time, maybe, or it was close. It was up there, and yeah. So they slipped that in, and who were the people that slipped that in? I mean, we talked about this in that documentary I did that you were a main part of. Our main centerpiece was Mitch McConnell, and that's who it seems like it was pushed through. But could you talk a little bit about that and who?
I didn't follow all the names and all of the folks, but certainly Mitch McConnell was a major, and if probably the major force behind it, which is very ironic given that was the major force to get hemp legalized in the first place. But we had really, I think this is less about individual members of Congress than it is about certain anti-hemp and even anti-overall cannabis lobbying groups and industries that wanted to see this happen, and they lobbied McConnell and other senators and House members significantly to get this done.
Yeah. So, and some of those, industries or those anti-hemp groups, I mean, you've got big alcohol, right? Who, allegedly paid Mitch McConnell about $900,000, right, from a Kentucky distillery. Or that's what I saw in the news. I don't know if that's for sure true or not.
I'm not sure. A lot of money though.
Yeah, a lot of money there. You've got, the MSOs that have been pushing this, trying to get rid of this because it, people like Truly or whatever that are, feeling like hemp is impeding on their market in Florida, for example. What are some of the other groups that I guess were really petitioning for this?
I think those are the big three really are, there's always going to be, anti-cannabis, generally, prohibitionist forces. smart approaches to marijuana called SAM, comes in really heavy on pretty much any bill that limits access to cannabis in any form. And so they're there. They're always going to be there. Then you had big alcohol and the sort of big corporate marijuana MSOs, both that see this as a competitor. But what's interesting, and again, to sort of hammer on my platform about this isn't really a referendum in the way that it looks, is even those industries that we just talked about, the alcohol industry and the big marijuana industry, they're fragmented within themselves as well. I mean, a lot of alcohol companies are getting into hemp and hemp beverages specifically. Most, maybe all the MSOs have at least put their big toe in the hemp world, and some of them have really gone in full force. And I think, those industries have seen how hemp can really expand their bottom line, and to the extent that they care about cannabis at all, how it can expand access. So, again, those are the industries that were pushing it, but I don't see that that's even a sort of a unified front on those industries as well. One thing that bothers me, to kind of dig into this a little bit deeper, though, is I think in the cannabis industry at whole, and I'm talking about hemp, I'm talking about marijuana, I'm talking about the different product categories within those different parts of the supply chain, is we see a lot of fragmentation there. And so there are groups out there that are ostensibly pro-cannabis. And again, I'm using that term in the broad sense, pro-cannabis, that are, applauding this and saying, the hemp loophole needed to be shut, or maybe we can keep beverages, but certainly THCA flower should go away, and blah, 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 blah. And I don't understand that, that at all. For one thing, if you believe in cannabis, it's perfectly understandable to think that, we do need, cannabis needs some regulations, but to say that we need to put it back into sort of the regulated cannabis, the marijuana space, which is onerous and has all sorts of problems, and cut off access to to millions of consumers, and just pull out the rug out from underneath hemp companies that have really put a lot of investment and time and resources and made good products and employ people. That's just insanity to me. That they would do that. And also certain product categories, we say, well, this product category should be allowed, but this one shouldn't. And very often it's, drinks should be allowed, but not flower. And, I love hemp and THC beverages and whatnot. I also love flower as well. And so to try to play those off against each other, that's just really going to be bad for the whole industry. And I really am here to sort of preach this unified effort. Hemp and cannabis generally is going to win if we can come at this with a real unified front. But I don't want to get too far down the road on that. I'm sure we're going to talk about some things that people can do and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think you bring up a great point, though. There is obviously a mini civil war. There's a lot of different kind of little mini wars, internal wars going on in the entire cannabis hemp world. A lot of different, interests that are conflicting, and some that are, work together. Yeah. So I definitely, 100%. I mean, there's also just a lot of confusion on this. And I think there's a lot of people that don't understand, really. They still, to this day, I mean, even though we've done so much education online, just trying to explain to people, THCA is really just regular weed, just add heat to it. Anyway, I guess, to talk about this, though, I want to, we'll dive into kind of how it affects businesses here in a sec. But in terms of, one of the things I was saying about this, and I've talked to a lot of people, yourself, a lot of other business owners in this space, and really, this was probably the best, most egalitarian version of federal legalization. Would you agree with that? And in the sense of everyone got a chance to compete. It doesn't have all of the barriers to entry that all these state markets have that have so many problems. I mean, really terrible. And now that they repealed this version of federal, this is really a form of federal legalization, interstate commerce.
Absolutely.
What's your thoughts on that? And then also, what could you what are we going to get now that we got rid of this original form?
Yeah, sure. What did hemp mean? And then what do we do now? So I agree with you on those points. And I think that I'm often and understandably portrayed as sort of a hemp lawyer or a hemp advocate. But the reality is I'm a cannabis lawyer and an advocate for cannabis. And what hemp represented was sort of a reset of how cannabis legalization was beginning to play out, which was the, state regulated market, super heavily, overly, regulated, no interstate commerce, terrible taxation, can't even get a safe banking bill passed, blah, 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 blah. A lot of, people worked really hard to open those state markets, and there's some, groundbreaking stuff that happened. A lot of people put a lot of investment into that, and that's super laudable. But we all have to agree that system is broken, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And so, on the other hand, we have hemp, which it's just cannabis. Literally, the definition of hemp is cannabis sativa with no more than 0.3% delta 9 THC. It's just cannabis, and it was completely removed, completely descheduled, with frankly not a whole lot of limitations there, and it provided a whole redo. It allowed for banking and insurance and interstate commerce, and not this onerous tax burden, and also and I think that one of the biggest things is it allowed for small businesses to engage in the hemp and the cannabis trade. And that brings me to sort of a side point. I think and I've mentioned this before on different podcasts and things, but if you were to sort of take all of us who are in the industry now, who are advocates for cannabis and and put us back, several decades, let's say years and years before any sort of legalization was happening, and you say, what does the ideal cannabis market look like to you? Well, I think it would look a lot more like the hemp market than it would the marijuana market. And that is, interstate commerce. Hey, I can order something to my home, or I can go to a store, but also from the business standpoint, hey, if I want to be a grower, if I want to open a retail shop, or if I want to participate in some way in the supply chain, I can do it. And by and large, none of those things are true with the marijuana market. So all of that is to say that Congress legalized hemp, and it was really good for cannabis. Congress, the feds dropped the ball, particularly the FDA, in not regulating, and certainly, any kind of, we regulate, the food supply, it's not, and so, we need reasonable regulations, and those didn't happen federally. States came in, we have a hodgepodge, and it was really just an opportunity that was missed. So where does that leave us now? So Congress at this moment has taken that definition of hemp and that industry that the almost $30 billion industry that's taken off and evolved from the 2018 Farm Bill, and has now pulled the rug out, redefined hemp, put a whole lot of restrictions that we can talk about on it, and given the industry a year to try to propose a new bill or be out of business and go back to the way things were. Which is mostly really difficult for consumers, really difficult for businesses, and a real open market for the black market, frankly. So that's where we are, I think. And I'm really, really disappointed that more people didn't see hemp as the opportunity for cannabis that it really is. And cannabis advocates who are good advocates and outspoken advocates who are talking about how, thank God we finally closed this loophole. I just don't understand that at all.
It comes from a frustration in my mind. It comes from a frustration where, they paid their dues. We've talked about this before on camera. They paid their dues. They had to do the state market bullshit. In a lot of these states, it's very difficult. It's very frustrating. And there's a lot of stuff you have to do. And I think there's a lot of animosity there because they saw, wow, look at these people that are, that went the hemp route, and they now have, they're not paying as much taxes. They're able to, to conduct interstate commerce. There's all these benefits to it. And I think, honestly, there was just a lot of frustration there, and I think got channeled into that. And it's in my mind, I think it's very short-sighted of these people, very, very short-sighted, because I think now it's going to be a mess, obviously, with this whole situation, but we're probably going to get now a much more, in a lot of ways, it was, you could argue it was kind of confusing initially with the initial, rollout of the 2018 Farm Bill, but it made sense. People got it, and it was egalitarian in my mind. Now I think that everyone's seen the money on the table. The next 3-5 years or whatever is going to be a dogfight with so many different groups, and it's going to be, and if you think there's lobbying money going into cannabis or hemp now, it's like, bro, alcohol's coming in, like all these companies, all these different industries have been in this for a while, but it's going to get, they're going to really turn on the faucet now. And I don't think we're going to get a very good system I don't have a lot of faith in our lawmakers. And to be honest, and really one of the things, when we talked a couple of years ago, we kind of had to trick our politicians to give us an egalitarian system to a certain degree. And now that, now that they've reversed this, I think it's going to go the way of corporate interests and, snub out the small, the little guy, and do all those different things. But yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how this all turns out. So in terms of, how is this about to affect these, different small, medium, large hemp operating businesses in your
Yeah,
mind?
sure. But before I answer that, I want to just
Yeah.
respond quickly to what you said.
Yeah.
I understand the frustration with, if you, spent years lobbying in California, Colorado, Washington, wherever, for medical and then, adult use marijuana, and you founded your business on those regulations, and, you've paid lots of money and paid lots of taxes and so on and so forth. And then, suddenly this new law opens up and people are coming in and not having to go through all that, and also selling interstate and competing with you. Man, I completely get that. But I have, sort of two responses that I always say to that. One is like, there's the example of just, innovation and regulatory changes. You look at the taxi industry, and then Uber comes along, and a lot of taxis, the taxi industry really pushed back against that, but over time they adapted and adopted. But even more importantly, I think what we see is that a lot of folks who are in the hemp space would like to participate in the adult use or the medical space, but can't for various reasons, competitive applications, closed applications, all blah, blah, blah.
Limited
But the
licenses. Yeah.
licenses and whatnot. But the opposite is by and large not true. If you're in marijuana, regulated cannabis, and hemp is regulated too, that's a whole different discussion. If you're in that industry, you can pivot into hemp, and a lot of our great clients are companies that are in the marijuana space who have expanded into the hemp space and done really well. And so I think, it doesn't foreclose an opportunity. It might make us pivot, but that's the world we live in right now. So that's one thing. You mentioned something about not having a lot of faith in lawmakers, man. I feel that, but I do want to make two quick shout outs to lawmakers. First of all, Rand Paul has been an incredible supporter of the hemp industry, and regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum in terms of Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, whatever, you've got to give it up for Rand Paul, who has gone out of his way to help this industry with bills, with making things public, with meeting with constituents and lobbyists, and so on and so forth. So thank you. Also, Senator Wyden has done a great job, and I anticipate that we'll see some things maybe from his office, maybe for some other offices, some bills that will help to reopen and expand the hemp industry. So that sort of pivots into, what's going on and what can we expect for companies. So I think I want to say something that's going to sound really dire, and I'm happy to explain it. But it's true. And that is, if nothing happens between now and November 2026, because there was a year, and I'll make that clear, Congress passed a law that pretty much killed the hemp industry, but it didn't make the law effective for a year. So next November 2026, if nothing else happens, the hemp industry is going to effectively die. People say, oh, well, the CBD industry or blah, blah, blah. None of that's going to be possible for a lot of reasons that we can go into, but it's going to die. So that's the bad news. The good news is, again, this is a golden opportunity for the industry to really put forth some bills to regulate. So in terms of what businesses are doing, it's still early days. We're talking today on November 19th. The bill was only passed a week or so ago. But what I'm hearing is that most people are intending to stay in it. What they're doing is saying, well, we're going to go at this as long as we can. And we're also going to, to the extent we haven't before, lobby or help promote and to support industry associations that are lobbying for good hemp regulation and to keep the industry open. What we're seeing not happen is a lot of companies were contemplating long-term commercial leases, maybe making capital expenditures for equipment and whatnot. It's maybe long-term supply agreements and so on and so forth. We're seeing the brakes being tapped on those types of things. Like, well, we hope and we believe that the industry is going to stay open in some way, shape, or form, but we don't know what that looks like, and we don't know for sure that's even going to happen. So these large, capital resources, we're seeing the brakes tapped quite a bit there. And so what I would say to folks is, if we want an industry, some of that money that you were going to put towards the capital expenditures, put towards lobbying put towards industry associations. I don't typically call out industry associations here because inevitably I forget one, or I say one and people are like, no, not that one, blah, blah, blah. But if you have a question as to what industry associations you should be supporting, feel free to reach out to me, reach out to Luke, and we can make some recommendations. But, to the extent that companies have been able to just sort of cruise along while all of these hemp fights have been going on and allow others to do that fight for them. Well, no, here we are. This is the battle right here. It's time, if you want to be in the industry, to put the resources towards it, or we won't have an industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's going to be an absolute dogfight this coming year. It's going to be really interesting to see. So one of the things I guess I foresee a little bit with, we're starting to already see now some traction on some movement now, because what's happening here is now you've got state market, or you've got hemp markets, right? So for example, you've got, for folks that aren't aware, all of the states that haven't created their own recreational programs, right? This 2018 Farm Bill pretty much forced a federal system onto them. And it made it so that they could have, unless the state specifically banned it in their state, it pretty much created the hemp industry, or the THC industry. So some of the big states that this came about in is, for example, Texas, North Carolina, Florida, there's plenty of other states where this happened. You're now starting to see, because now, for example, Texas is an $8 billion hemp industry. Like it's eight or 9 billion.
I've seen some numbers. It's in the billions for sure. Yeah. It's up there.
100%. And so now it's like there's 60,000 plus jobs on the line. There's thousands of businesses, so much to the economy that could be taken away.
Consumers who use these products who don't have a viable alternative. There's Teacup. Absolutely. Teacup has lots of problems. That's another discussion. But at a minimum, we can, I think anyone can agree that it does not provide the products, that Texans consumers want. Yeah. and
100%. And now we're starting to see all of these states are going to start to jump into action and implement their own regulations. What's your thoughts on that? And could you speak on, some of the different states that, I just mentioned here, especially your home state, North Carolina?
Yeah. So I think, hemp, for the most part, really took hold in states that didn't have, really viable, marijuana programs, medical or adult use. North Carolina is probably in a lot of respects considered to be sort of ground zero for hemp and the hemp industry. A lot of my clients I mentioned earlier in the marijuana industry, and they expand into hemp. A lot of them open their operations in North Carolina. And North Carolina notably has no medical marijuana, no adult use recreational marijuana, no nada. And so the hemp industry really took hold there. I think something similar happened in Texas, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, a lot of these southern states. But then, it's interesting. People saw a lot of the innovation, a lot of what was happening there. And those industries started to push into states where there was adult use and recreational. And that's where a lot of the friction started to happen on the quote unquote cannabis civil war stuff. So I think, the hemp industry sort of, to extent that's never happened, I believe, and certainly since cannabis has been outlawed in the 1930s, it really helped to normalize. I remember the days, and you probably do too, when CBD was highly controversial. The fact, I had, all these super intense, passionate discussions and debates about, a CBD gummy, was something that we ought to be promoting. Well, now, everyone every grandmother and her, kids and grandkids take CBD. No one has any concern about that. And then I remember the first time that, sort of broad spectrum or, CBD products, there was some THC in there, and they're being sold in pretty mainstream outlets, and like, wow, THC is being sold legally throughout the country. And that was a big issue. And then of course we've seen all the permutations and how that's evolved. But it's really, really normalized cannabis use to people that otherwise would have never seen that. So, again, the hemp industry is an industry that I really support, but it's primarily because I support cannabis. And I think it's not the end all be all. There's lots of problems that the hemp industry needs to address, but it really pushed the ball down the court a long way towards full cannabis legalization and normalization.
Absolutely. I really could not agree more with you. It absolutely did, especially in the Southeast, right? The Southeast, yeah. The Bible, the
Bible Belt. Yeah.
The Bible Belt. There we go. Thank you. The Bible Belt. It's very big there now. And it definitely sped up legalization in my mind. I see Texas is now, moving to create their own regulations. That's obviously going to be a dogfight there. I saw South Carolina is now going to implement. I mean, there's now money. There's once you have people that open businesses, they're paying taxes. You've got jobs. You've got economic stimulus. Like, it's hard to put that toothpaste back in the
Yeah.
in the bottle. But I guess with your home state, what do you think is going to happen with North Carolina? Because, like you did say, North Carolina has become, I would say, the capital of hemp THCA. Right, a lot of these big companies now move their distribution over to North Carolina, and countless people. I mean, a lot of people that we both mutually know.
Yeah.
What do you think is going to happen there specifically?
Yeah, I think North Carolina, Texas, some of these states are going to be potentially a bellwether, and I could talk about why I think North Carolina is in the position that it's in. There's a sort of a confluence of events, the stars sort of aligned. But I think what's important is what's going to happen there now. And so North Carolina, hemp is defined by statute almost exactly the way the feds define it, and otherwise there's no regulatory structure at all in place. And I think a lot of people are like, that's great. But, there's a lot of problems with not having a proper regulatory structure. So I think we're going to see that type of thing in North Carolina. There's a couple of good bills that would really establish licensing and, what's required on COAs and labeling and age gating and all those important things. And I think something like that's going to pass. But the question that I'm getting asked a lot about states, whether it be North Carolina or Texas or even Georgia or whatever, is, what happens if nothing changes? Federally hemp becomes, essentially illegal. I mean, we can go into all the details about that, but effectively the rug's pulled out from under it. But they're in a state where hemp is still legal. Those laws are still on the books. There's a lot to unpack and a lot of complexity. There's, for example, a lot of states' laws as it relates to controlled substances are directly sort of tied to the feds. So if the feds, schedule a substance, then the state law is triggered to automatically schedule that same substance and vice versa. And so some of those laws may be impacted, although hemp is still technically legal. It's just defined differently. But I think the big issue is, can companies like that still operate? And I think the big answer is yes. If you're in Texas, you're in North Carolina, and those laws are still in place, you can still operate there. The problem is the hemp industry is built really on interstate commerce, which is how almost everything in the national economy works. You've got a facility over here, you got a grower over there, you've got customers here, and blah, blah, blah. And so you have to operate solely within your own state. And that's going to be really difficult from a supply chain standpoint. It's going to be really difficult potentially for a consumer, and customer standpoint. And also all it does is really just convert all of these hemp states into adult use or type states where you're operating federally illegally. So as banking and merchant processing are going to be difficult. You're under the threat of the DEA raiding your facility and putting you in jail, 280E taxation, all of that junk happens. And at the same time, what we see is that the black market grows to fill in the need, as a lot of people just can't do that. So anyway, that is to say that from a technical standpoint, I think a lot of people will still be able to operate within their own states, but will it really be a functional system? Yeah, not so much.
Yeah, it's definitely it's going to be a conundrum for sure. I'm curious too. So going into, how much time have we got? Another 20 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Obviously, one of the really tragic things that happened with this, quick move that got pulled on us really here is it now is affecting the seed business, right? The
Yeah.
genetics business. Can we talk a little bit about that? How does that
Yeah, for
affect
sure.
it? And yeah.
Well, so what the current law says, or the law before it was changed, but what's still in effect, the 2018 Farm Bill said that, hemp is cannabis and all of its parts, including the seeds thereof, with no more than 0.3% Delta 9 THC. And so what this said is that seeds, formerly seeds that were not viable, had some legal status, but now viable seeds, meaning seeds that can grow into cannabis plants, are legal, provided that the seeds themselves have no more than 0.3% Delta 9 THC. And the DEA confirmed this. And so what that's allowed is, regardless of what the seed came from or what it might grow into, if it doesn't have more than 0.3% delta 9 THC, it's lawful. Well, guess what? No seeds have more than 0.3% delta 9 THC. The only way they could have more than that is if they were really dusted with a whole lot of trichomes and pollen and that kind of thing. But the seeds themselves have almost no cannabinoids. So that's allowed the seed industry to really flourish. What's changed is that now the law says, still can't be more than 0.3% total THC. That's again fine, because seeds don't have a whole lot of THC. They can be viable. That's okay. But, and here's the kicker, they can't come from a plant that didn't meet the definition of hemp. And so seeds can only come from plants that meet the definition of hemp. And botanically speaking, that may be okay. But a plant that meets the definition of hemp is one that has no more than 0.3% delta 9, or when the new law comes into effect, no more than 0.3% total THC, all forms of THC and also THCA. And so, can you harvest seeds before a plant sort of reaches that level of THC? Possibly, possibly not. But that's a big distinction. And what it may do is really downsize the cannabis seed industry if they can't get seeds from marijuana plants before they sort of reach that 0.3% threshold. And I also want to correct some things that I've seen, even some of my colleagues have been putting this out there. I've seen it in news reports and everything. What they say about the new law is that if a seed has the potential to grow into a high THC plant, then that seed is illegal. That is not what the law says at all. And frankly, you can put any seed in the ground and grow a little bit before the plant gets to be more than 0.3%, and then trim it regardless of the genetics of that seed. So it's not only is that not what the law says, but it's a little bit nonsensical. So I just want to be clear: the law is not that a seed that has the potential to grow into a high THC plant is illegal. It's the law will be that a seed that comes from a high THC plant is going to be illegal. And that sounds subtle, but it's a pretty big distinction, I think.
Yeah, well, that almost makes it now. I mean, in terms of people trying to breed, super high quality feminized seeds, right? That's going to be very, very tough. I mean, legal,
Yeah.
right? So it's like,
yeah.
So that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
Still is obviously. I mean, that's a good. I did see that everywhere. I did see if it has the potential to grow to, to have above 0.3. So thank you for clarifying that. How do you think that, let's say, whatever happens, right? Let's say this law goes through, it's going to go through, it's going to make it all the way through the year, gets implemented. Some states implement their own hemp program, some don't. What are your predictions on enforcement from the feds? And we'll start with the feds, DEA, et cetera.
Yeah, I think we'll still tend to see most of the enforcement at the state level, and that's where we've seen almost all the enforcement so far. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is I think the DEA doesn't have the resources to really kind of police this. Secondly, I think that the DEA doesn't want to lose in court. And you and I have had conversations about certain hemp products and whether they meet the definition of hemp, and they're controversial. But the DEA has staked out some positions, say on THCA flower and some other things, Delta 8 even in the past. But I think it sort of puts these positions out, but it doesn't necessarily want to enforce that, because if it takes people to court and loses, it's got egg on its face. And then that really reinforces the legal status. It goes from sort of a gray area that's controversial to court ruled in a particular case brought by the DEA that this is legal. So I think the DEA doesn't want to put itself in those shoes. And I think the DEA by and large will continue to take that stance. Maybe the DEA will make a few sort of high profile, do a couple of raids and some arrests, make some examples of folks. But I still think even there, it'll be very, very black and white as to what's going on. I don't think they're going to police this sort of on the cusp type of a thing. They're going to allow the states to continue doing that type of work. And to be clear, I think, a lot of sheriff's offices have, DEA agents that also have their offices there. And sometimes they have agreements to work together on certain things. That's pretty normal. And I do think that the DEA is sort of behind the scenes informing sheriff's offices and maybe, encouraging them to go out and do this. So the DEA continues to do the work it does, but it hasn't been as out front as we might have expected. And I think that's going to be the same.
Okay. That makes sense. So overview, they may make some few examples here and there to scare people, but they don't have this is obviously, everyone's involved now in this industry. So it's going to be very tough for them to
Yeah,
really do any sort of meaningful crackdown in any sort of way.
absolutely.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But state wise, there is some problems that could happen there. Is there any sort of for in the future? I don't know if this is even possible because you would need federal law, I guess. But I've seen some people talk about having maybe a few states agree to allow for interstate commerce between them potentially.
Mhm.
That would take federal intervention, right?
Yeah, there's some really interesting developments going on in the marijuana space right now along those lines. Like, for example, can Washington, Oregon, and California agree and have some kind of compact that allows the products to go between their state lines, even there's crossing state lines, which is sort of federal jurisdiction. If they all agree, can this happen? And we're in the early days of that, and there's some arguments pro and con. States have a lot of sovereignty and authority. Essentially the Constitution says, whatever the federal government doesn't control, states control. And so there's this idea, and I'm just giving the highest level. I'm not going into any of the details and the legal side, but this idea that, well, if a state, A, wants to enact cannabis laws that are contrary to the feds, maybe it can do that. But what if other states want to band together and do that? That there's a lot of, it makes sense that they would have the authority to do that. But on the other hand, when it comes to interstate commerce, that is something that the government regulates. The Commerce Clause is part of the Constitution. And so ultimately, even if states have this compact, it seems, potentially vulnerable to the feds coming in and saying, sorry, we regulate interstate commerce. Y'all are engaged in interstate commerce in a Schedule I drug. And so we're going to intervene and get rid of it. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I think we'll see some attempts at that, I guess. We're already seeing attempts at that in the marijuana space. But I don't know if they will ultimately stick.
Yeah, that seems like a tough one. I'm curious. So, for example, right, one of the great things about interstate commerce, what we got with hemp, was the emergence of e-commerce, right?
Mhm.
Delivery to someone's door, multiple states. You've got now companies that have hundreds of thousands of customers that they service in a number of different states. If you had to guess, like in terms of the prediction of like, what are they just going to shut down? Like, let's just say, yeah, they get rid of interstate commerce. This whole thing goes through. It lasts throughout the year. What are these companies just going to give up their 400,000 person customer list? Their customers. Like what do you foresee with that, and what do you see some of the things that could potentially happen there? Because I almost see some of these companies, potentially just moving to black market almost, or I don't know. I guess you speak on that a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a purely technical legal standpoint, if nothing happens between now and November, then selling products that don't meet the definition of hemp or prohibited by the new law across state lines or at all would be illegal. And I certainly couldn't advise clients to do that. Will those companies sort of turn to the black market? Sure, I'm sure there's some actors that will just kind of go to the dark web, so to speak. And you can buy anything on the dark web these days, it seems like. And where some of the mainstream companies continue, I think the answer is no. They'll probably pivot in some way, shape, or form, or maybe wind things down. But what this is super frustrating to me, because we're really seeing major attempts to put this toothpaste back in the tube, to use your reference. This is the modern world, and whether we like it or not, so much of what we purchase, whether it be tennis shoes or or deodorant, or you just name the consumer item, shampoo, and we can order it online, and less are people going to stores. I like stores. I like walking to stores and that kind of thing too. And I believe and hope that they will continue to exist. But the reality is we have an online marketplace and we have a connected country. And so to try to say, oh, well, we're not going to allow interstate commerce in hemp and cannabis products is just going backwards in a major way. It's only really a matter of time before that's rectified. Now, whether that matter of time is it gets rectified this year and we fix it, or 20 years from now, we go through this whole another period of prohibition and finally come out. It's just a cultural momentum in terms of having interstate trade and these internet online sales. And so I think ultimately that will happen. I just don't know when or what it looks like.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's definitely going to absolutely bolster up the black market for sure, at least for some sort of time, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is really the hemp, the continuing resolution that was anti-hemp, should have been called the black market, giveaway, or promote the
Stimulus
black market
package.
bill,
Yeah,
because the stimulus package, because this really does nothing more than just put everything towards to the black market, because these products and the consumers wanting these products, that's not going away. It's what's going away are the legitimate businesses that were manufacturing and distributing these products.
absolutely, absolutely. Anything else you want to touch on?
I'm glad that we talked about some of the big overarching things. There's a lot of material out there, and you can go to my website, if you want to look into some of the nuances as to what this law means. I think in the bigger picture, where we are now is the industry, really needs to kind of, look up from its immediate surroundings and its immediate, world, support lobbying, support, you know, industry groups that are doing the right thing, and also just this, resist the fragmentation. There's the old saying, divide and conquer. And what we're already seeing is those forces that are anti-hemp are already beginning to push to divide and conquer. And the place I see this the most is something we've already talked about, and that is between the flower, the smokable side, and the beverage side. And I think that, I've seen, unfortunately, some folks, and it tends to be on the beverage side, who are willing, even eager, seems like, to kind of throw the flower side of the industry under the bus in order to preserve the drinks. And that's frustrating to me. Again, I strongly support hemp cannabis beverages. I drink and use hemp and cannabis beverages, and I'm fortunate to represent some of the best brands and manufacturers of hemp beverages in the world. So this is not about the category, but what I believe it is it's about sort of a short-sightedness in terms of fragmenting the industry and losing our momentum, being sort of, if something passes that just allows hemp beverages and disallows everything else, then the industry is beholden to those forces that allowed that to happen. And additionally, the hemp industry and these beverages are not the alcohol industry, and so I've seen a lot of well-written things about how we should just plug into the alcohol regulatory industry segment. There are a lot of good arguments for that, and I understand the approach, but this is not alcohol. This is cannabis. And whether companies want to kind of, pretend like they're in the alcohol industry, but selling cannabinoids, if they want to do that, that's not the reality. The reality is they're selling cannabinoids in a drink format, and that requires us to really support the whole industry, the whole plant. And even if you're not selling THCA flower, that's great, but you need to support it, because all ships will rise with this tide. So I hope that made sense. That was my little sort of rant of the moment, but it really is about unity and about resisting the forces that would want us to fragment so they could defeat us and divide us and conquer us. And the cannabis industry as a whole really needs to come together, because ultimately, in the big picture, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, maybe the 20-year picture, we're not going to have marijuana laws and hemp laws. We're going to have cannabis laws. And the only way to really make those things come together is to focus on this as being one plant. And that doesn't mean putting everything back into the dysfunctional regulated market. And it doesn't necessarily mean that hemp is the end all be all, but it means that we can take the things that we've learned to craft regulations that really work, and that make sense for the whole industry and for the whole plant.
Rod Kite, thanks for joining me, bro. That was great.
Man, thanks for having me. It's great. Always great to talk with you. I love your insights and great questions, and just great advocacy for the industry. So, Luke, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. And if folks, you guys want, what's your website, by the way, before you go?
Yeah, cannabusiness.law. So cannabusiness.law. Feel free to go to my site. The blog is there, and I really try to, stay up to date with what's going on. And I also have some great attorneys working with the firm, and they'll do guest posts as well. So yeah, please check out the blog, check out the website, and certainly reach out if we can help in any way.
Awesome. Thank you so much, man. I really, really appreciate it. Sweet. All right, guys. So what do you guys think? Let me know what you guys think down below. Thank you, Rod, for joining us. Man, a lot is happening here, folks. A lot is happening. stay up to date. Make sure, if you're being affected by this, stay strong. You got 1 year, obviously, to make some adaptations, or we'll have to see what happens. This is the industry in general, though. This is the cannabis industry in general. You got to adapt. We are in one of the craziest industries out there. So good luck, everyone. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Hope this was informational, educational. And please, guys, follow us on all the social medias. Links are down below. Hit the like button, share this, comment down below. And yeah, guys, appreciate you. You guys have an amazing, amazing Wednesday. Stay frosty.